Botgrinder. What can we say about Botgrinder? He flies hard, he crashes a lot, and he crashes in environments that are very unfriendly. You take a look at a guy like me, and I'm usually flying over trees, over grass, over a field. You put me in a concrete bando, and I get very uncomfortable because my Freestyle frames are designed for a balance between durability and lightweight and performance. And that means when you take my Freestyle frame to like a concrete bando, you're pretty much guaranteed that it's gonna break. But Botgrinder's frame, the Demibot, that's what we're looking at today, is designed around the idea that you should be able to crash as hard as you want and pretty much not break anything. And if that sounds similar to another frame that I've looked at recently, the Rotor Riot Tanq, you're right. It does sound similar. But today, we are going to look at the Botgrinder Demibot. We're going to build it up, and then we're going to see how Botgrinder has approached the same design goals as the Rotor Riot Tanq and how he's approached them differently and maybe which one's better for you. I'm Joshua Bardwell. You're going to learn something today. I love how simple this frame is. There's just like not too many parts. There's arms, there's a top plate, there's a mid plate, and there's a bottom plate, and just a couple little miscellaneous pieces of hardware to hold it together. There are frames out there that are more complicated and fiddly, and they have some advantages, but the disadvantage is that complicated frames are more difficult to assemble, they're more difficult to maintain, and it's more difficult to make sure you have spares of whatever you broke when something breaks. In the case of the Demibot, there's basically 7 things you're going to want to have a spare of that might break, and it's going to be relatively easy to have that on hand. It's also going to be relatively easy to put it together, so let's do it. And the first thing we're going to do is take the mid plate, that's this plate here with the press nuts pre-installed in it, and we're going to install 4 more press nuts for our ESC and flight controller stack. The Demibot can mount either a 20 or a 30 millimeter flight controller, depending on your preference, and there is also mounting in the rear, as long as we're here, for both 20 and 30 millimeter devices. So it's able to fit the biggest VTXs that are out there, not just little 20 millimeter ones like the Cadix Vista or the O3, but bigger ones like the HD0 Freestyle or the Walksnail VTXs. We're going to get this separate bag of press nuts, and we're going to take 4 of those press nuts, and we're going to use the screw and washer that come with it to install them. The way that's going to work is I'm going to take one of these press nuts and I'm going to put it in one of the screw holes that I'm going to use. The outer one's for 30 millimeter flight controllers and the inner one's for 20. Then I'm going to take this screw and I'm going to put the washer on it, and I'm going to thread that in from the back side, and I'm basically just going to tighten that down with my driver so it pulls the press nut into the carbon. I'm going to want to just get that to grip a little bit so it doesn't spin. If it spins, it can actually sort of shred the carbon. We don't want that. I'm just going to pull that down in until it's snug. Make sure you're installing those on the same side as the other press nuts that come with it. And for everybody who watched my review of, I think it was the Pirat Frame Sloop, where I ripped out one of the press nuts with this driver, and people said, it's not the press nuts that are weak, it's your driver. You shouldn't have used a driver, and that's why you destroyed them. Number one, this is a very precisely torque-controlled driver. I know what I'm doing. And number 2, I didn't rip out a single one of these press nuts because they're big and beefy. If you want to learn more about this driver and why it's so special, I actually have a review up on my channel. I'll put a link down in the video description below. Next, we are going to flip this over so the press nuts are on the underside, and we're going to take this little square piece here. It's going to go, there's a screw's going to go through it, and it's going to go into the center one. But I just want to show you what's going on here is that the 4 arms are going to come together and they're going to brace against this center piece, and that's what's going to kind of keep them from wiggling. I'm not sure if there is any kind of like camming mechanism, like they're bracing up against it, but some frames will actually design so that as the screws come together, it kind of pulls everything in and kind of wedges it in. I'm not sure that that's what's going on here. It is just sort of pressing up against it. And the downside of that is that if the machining is not extremely precise, then there won't be quite as much pressure applied. If they're smart about how they design it, they'll do something like make this slightly oversized so that as it comes together, it kind of wedges in. We'll see when we put the screws in. Next, we're going to get the bottom plate, and I want you to see that the bottom plate has countersunk screw holes. Those countersunk screw holes are going to go out, and we're just going to kind of line this up. We'll get one of these 5 countersunk screws. We'll put that in the center here. we'll put that little square plate through it, like so, and then we will line that up and thread that loosely into the center hole on the bottom plate, or the mid plate rather. And that's where we're going to be. By the way, Botgrinder also sends, I'm just going to look in here and kind of turn that square so it's more or less straight, so that it's in the right orientation when I put the arms in. One of the things I always check on frames, if I'm not sure, is if the arms are symmetrical and if there is an up or down way to put the arms in. And we can do that just by holding two arms and then flipping one of them over. And I can see that everything lines up exactly when I flip them over. So they appear to be symmetrical, and the front and the back, all four arms appear to be identical and symmetrical. Well, that's great because it means that you can't install the arm wrong. And it's great because it means that if you have one spare arm, you have a spare for all four locations. Some frames will have a different arm for the front or the back, especially dead cat style frames. And in that case, you need at least two spare arms, one for the front, one for the back. Now we'll just go ahead and insert that arm, and the screw hole here should line up, and we could put a countersunk screw right there. Whenever I'm using press nuts, I always take a look at how far into the press nut the screw goes. And you can see we are at least a couple threads shy of being flush with the top of the press nut. Now, these are fairly deep press nuts, and so I feel like we've still got plenty of thread engagement. I'm not too worried about ripping it out, but there is a part of me that wishes that this screw was like a millimeter longer. That might be like an odd size. Sometimes it can be hard to get screws in odd sizes. So maybe 2 millimeters longer, and maybe it would extend up through here by perhaps a thread or a thread and a half. Just the more engagement with those threads you have, the stronger everything is going to be, and the less likely it's going to be to rip out. And before you say, well, Bardwell, did you use the wrong screws? Like, the only other countersunk screws that are in here are these, and they are actually shorter. So I'm pretty sure these are the right ones. The Demibot has gone with this sort of standard by now design choice of having the inner screw in a channel, so that if you need to change an arm, you just take out the outer screw, you slide the arm out, and you don't have to take apart the stack screws. Early frames that hadn't learned this lesson would have the stack screws going through the arm, and then the arm screw that holds the arm in was also the stack screw. That was a pain in the ass because you had to take your flight control stack apart if you wanted to replace an arm. The downside of this approach would be that this can create a weak spot where the carbon is thinner, and as the arm takes stress and levers against this point, it creates stress here and this breaks off. But I really don't think that's going to be a problem on this frame because these are gigantic 6 millimeter thick arms, and I don't think the arms are likely to break at all. Never mind in that location. The other reason I don't think that's going to be a problem here is that this channel here doesn't extend all the way up close to this screw hole. So this is going to be the fulcrum point when the arm takes a hit, and the stress is all going to be applied like in this area right here. And you can see that we have, you know, a good length, maybe as much as a centimeter perhaps, of solid thick carbon before we get to this weaker spot. So there's just not going to be a lot of leverage applied here where it gets a little bit thinner. So I said that the arms on the Demibot are 6 millimeters thick. The mid plate and bottom plate and top plate are all 3 millimeters thick. There are people who would say that that's overkill, that you could save a fair amount of weight by going even down to 2.5 millimeter plates, and that's pretty standard on like mid-tier durability frames. And then some frames would even go down to 2 millimeters if they really wanted to save weight. 3 millimeters is going to significantly increase the durability of the frame while adding some weight. That's kind of the point of this frame, isn't it? Next, we're going to install the stack screws in whichever holes we put our press nuts into. This is going to be one of these times when I'm really glad to have an electric driver because these take for freaking ever to drive in. It's a really good thing that Botgrinder includes press nuts for the stack. There's some research that shows that the gyro gets significantly cleaner data if there is a nut holding this screw rigid, as opposed to having it sort of free floating and just held together by the ESC and the flight controller stack nuts. If you have a frame that doesn't have press nuts here in the bottom, the best advice is to get an M3 nut and run it down there at the very bottom of your stack. Next, we're going to get the bag of shorter countersunk nuts, and we're going to install the standoffs. There's going to be 4 standoffs in the front and 2 in the rear. And notice that the standoffs are not the same length as each other. The longer standoffs go in the front and the shorter standoffs go in the rear. Also, notice that the standoffs on the Demibot are significantly bigger than this typical standoff that I pulled from another frame set. Botgrinder says they're 1 millimeter bigger, and you can see that they're just beefier here in the wall, and that's going to improve their durability as well. The Demibot uses a 3D printed camera mount, and the advantage of that is going to be flexibility. If you have a standard 19 millimeter camera, if you have a Caddx Vista camera, which is like a 0.5 millimeter wider, or an 03, which is almost a full millimeter wider, you're not going to have any problem getting this to fit. The disadvantage of that is going to be that the camera's not going to have as much protection as like a custom metal or carbon fiber front end like we see here on the Tanq. The Tanq is carefully designed so that the camera is just behind the front of these the metal sidewalls, and that helps protect it against impacts, although nothing is completely protected. In the case of a frame like this, we're going to see that depending on what camera you've got, it's going to protrude out in front of these standoffs, and it may be a little more likely to take damage. Of course, since this is 3D printed, you certainly could customize the 3D print if you had the resources to do that, to kind of push your camera back or forward exactly where you wanted it. When you install the top plate, make note that the rear 2 standoff holes are countersunk. The others are not, so definitely put that on the right way up. And the reason these holes are not countersunk is it's assumed that you're going to be running a GoPro mount on the front, and these 4 holes will be used with screws to hold the GoPro mount on. If you do that, Botgrinder includes these countersunk washers, which will sort of flatten out the head of the countersunk screw and keep the countersunk screw from sort of digging its way through your TPU GoPro mount. There are 2 things that I overlooked when I first recorded this review, and it's me, Joshua from the future, coming back to pick it up, because there are things that I've complained about in the past with frames, and Umagod and Botgrinder have taken into account both of those things, and they deserve full credit for it. The first one is that they have included a good grippy battery pad. In fact, Umagod is, in my opinion, the inventor, if not the inventor, certainly the popularizer of grippy battery pads. It was his Umagrip product that first came up with the idea that a battery should not just like press up against the battery pad, but the battery pad should have some grip to it, and that'll help keep the battery from sliding out in a crash. In fact, when he first released this product, we did a video on my channel where he flew without a battery strap. Literally just stuck on with the Umagrip. Now, that's not a good idea. The Umagrip does get dusty, and it grips less when it's dusty and dirty than when it's brand new. So it still is way, way better than the standard type of battery pad that I see, and it's fantastic that they include it. This is actually the thinner Umagrip, and I guess that's okay because these screws are going to be holding the GoPro mount on, so the battery's not going to be there, and these screws are countersunk. So we don't really need any spacing to keep the battery from digging into the screw heads. We just need this to help the battery grip. I gotta try it. Battery. Umagrip. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, it will come loose, but that's good shit. The other thing I've complained about in the past is that motor manufacturers, they include screws with their motors, but the length of the motor screws is based on the thickness of the arms, it's based on the thickness of the arms. So the frame manufacturer should be the one to give you the motor screws because they know how thick the arms are. And sure enough, Botgrinder has done that as well. We got 16 motor screws here. Kudos to them for listening to me. That's what reviews are all about. Stroking my ego and making me feel like I'm smart and people care what I say. Pretty much the basis of my whole career. Don't tell my mother. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of a direct head-to-head comparison between the Rotor Riot Tanq and the Botgrinder Demibot, and try to help you decide which of these is better for you if you're shopping for a frame in this category. But before we do that, can I take a second to tell you about my Patreon? Patreon is a website where you can subscribe to me. For as little as $2 a month, or more if you feel like I've earned it, the amount you subscribe at is totally up to you. You can change the amount or unsubscribe whenever you feel like it. Patrons get exclusive access to my Discord server, which includes a troubleshooting forum and a buy-sell trade forum, as well as patrons get access to podcast downloads of all of my live streams. But I hope that that's why you subscribe. Good. Cool. I'm cool with that. But I'd really like you to subscribe when the day comes that you go, I've been watching Bardwell for so long, he's helped me so much, and today's the day I want to give back. If today's that day for you, there's a link in the video description below to where you can sign up for my Patreon. And if today's not that day, that's cool. I'm going to keep making the content, and you keep watching the content, and hopefully that day will come. So which is better, the Rotor Riot Tanq or the Botgrinder Demibot? And I'm not just comparing these two frames because there's history and drama between Botgrinder and Rotor Riot, and so people will get fired up. No, that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because these are both great frames, and they both fit in a very similar category with very similar design goals. So anybody who's shopping for a frame in this category probably needs to be looking at both of them. We certainly got to compare their weight. The Tanq comes in at 184 grams. The Demibot comes in at 172 grams. And that's a little unfair because the Tanq has some 3D prints on it. So let's just say that they are close to the same weight, within 10-ish grams of the same weight. And the exact weight is going to depend on like how much 3D printed crap you put on them. As far as their capabilities, they also seem pretty similar. Both of them have the ability to mount either a 20 or a 30 millimeter flight controller in the front, as well as the Demibot can do a 30 millimeter in the rear, whereas the Tanq only fits a 25. So the Demibot's going to have a little more room in the rear. One of the major differences between the Demibot and the Tanq is where they've put their carbon. The Demibot has 3 millimeter top, mid, and bottom plates with 6 millimeter arms, whereas the Tanq has 2.5 millimeter top, bottom, and mid plates with 8 millimeter arms. Also notice that the Tanq makes up for some of the weaker top and bottom plate by placing this standoff here, so you have a shorter length of unsupported top plate, whereas the Demibot has a relatively long length of unsupported top plate between the standoffs, but it's a thicker, more rigid top plate, so that kind of makes up for it. It's not really clear which of these decisions is like the best. The 6 millimeter arms on the Demibot are going to be more likely to break than the 8 millimeter arms on the Tanq, but 6 millimeter arms are already pretty freaking indestructible, and some would argue that the 8 millimeter arms on the Tanq are overkill. In the Rotor Riot video where I smashed the Tanq into the ground at full throttle, the arms didn't break. But unlike the third time I smashed it into the ground at full throttle, this screw hole just ripped out. The arm just levered out and tore the carbon. So that could be seen as an argument that the arms are too strong and the bottom plates are not strong enough. That would be an argument in favor of the Demibot. The truth is that there's no right answer here. Something will always be the weak spot and break. Right? So on the Demibot, it seems like Botgrinder is going for more of sort of an all-round balance between pretty strong arms and pretty strong top, bottom, and mid plate. Whereas on the Tanq, Sean Morrison seems to be saying my primary goal here is to not break an arm, and I'm still going to have pretty strong top, mid, and bottom plates, but if something breaks, this is going to be where it is. Just flip a coin and decide which one annoys you the most, changing the bottom plate or changing an arm. One place where I think the Tanq has a little bit of an advantage is in 3D printed accessories. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of 3D printed accessories for the Demibot. But Sean Morrison is continuously working on coming up with really interesting and novel 3D printed accessories for the Tanq. Things like weird antenna mounts that mount the antennas down on the rear of the frame, so they're practically impossible to break. Multi-material skids with like a rigid skid that doesn't wear away as much. Just really innovative stuff. And he publishes it all on his Thingiverse page. So if you were a big fan of 3D printed accessories, the Tanq would take a little bit of an edge. The top plate of the Demibot is way better to me than the top plate of the Tanq. I really hate it when a top plate doesn't have any kind of waistline or anything to keep the battery straps in place. It's really great that when we put battery straps on the Demibot, they are going to stay where we put them, and that's true for both the front and the rear. Whereas on the Tanq, this taper here means that you could end up with a little bit of slippage on the battery straps. The same is true here on the bottom. If we have zip ties or something going around here holding a video transmitter in place, the Demibot has notches to hold them, whereas on the Tanq, they're going to want to slide a little bit. This is a very minor thing, but it's an annoyance that I run into from time to time. If you've decided that the Demibot is the frame for you, I'd love it if you use the links in the video description to buy it. Those links are affiliate links, and it means that when you make any purchase at the store, after clicking that link, I get a little commission. It's a very easy way for you to support the channel, and it really means a lot. If you're not sure yet, then here's what you should do. First, watch my review of the Rotor Riot Tanq, and watch my review of the Flyfish RC Volador, which is not quite as durable as these two frames, in my humble opinion, because I already broke the arm on it. But it's still a really cool frame, and it's in a similar weight class, and it's more complex and less simple, but it has a lot to offer. I'll put cards on screen to those two videos, as well as links down below in the video description to the review, and I'll see you there.